Hello everybody, this is Refresh and I'm here to take a look at Sorin Planeswalker deck for Magic the Gathering Core Set 2020. According to the back here, Sorin Vampire Lord. Sorin is the card and Sorin Markov is the lord of a proud ancient lineage of vampire aristocrats. Gather an army of loyal vampires to drain the life from your opponents. You get a deck box, a 60 card deck that you can play tabletop or online, which means you get a code for Magic the Gathering Arena, one 15 card booster pack, which means that you get one less than usual. However, the cost of this deck is going to be a little bit less than the regular Planeswalker decks, and you get a strategy insert and 2 reference cards. Let's go ahead and confirm the contents. Alright, here's Sorin Vampire Lord. It is a 6 mana Planeswalker with 4 loyalty, and for +1 you get up to 1 target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. -2, Sorin Vampire Lord deals 4 damage to any target, you gain 4 life. And then -8 until end of turn, each vampire you control gain control of target creature. Wow, that's a pretty crazy ability right there. The +1 is probably the weakest thing, just giving a target creature +2/+0 isn't going to be the most powerful thing in the world, but you can -2 to deal 4 damage to a target and gain 4 life, so that's pretty impressive. Here is some cool Sorin art on the deck box. You get 1 pack of Core Set 2020 with Sorin's face on it. And you get a strategy insert. It says, hey, before you play. It just says to play with the deck a bit before you start modifying it. And then, playing the deck, Sorin is an even more formidable threat when he's surrounded by his vampire brethren. Summon hungry vampires that grow stronger as they drain life from your opponent while you clear the way by removing enemy creatures. Keep the pressure on your opponent until their life total has been fully consumed. This is flavorful, but it is a fairly generic description of play magic cards, so not that cool. Here is some information about some mechanics you're going to find in the deck. It's nothing that isn't already covered by the reminder text that's on the cards themselves. So I don't know how useful this is going to be, but there it is. And then a little bit of lore. Sorin Vampire Lord. Sorin Markov is the lord of an ancient and powerful vampire bloodline on the plane of Innistrad. Thousands of years old, feared by even his own kind, he is ferocious in battle, wielding a sword and deadly life-draining magic with equal skill. And when he encounters a threat he can't defeat alone, he can call on an army of vampires to fight by his side. It's a pretty generic description. I do like that it names Innistrad and tells you how old he is, but I kind of wish that there was just a little bit more story detail about why we should care about this guy other than, I am vampire guy. On the back we have a little description of how planeswalkers are used, and so that is useful, and I like that there are no ads on this. Let's take a look at the deck. Alright, our rare is Dread Presence. It is a 3/3 for 4, and it's a nightmare. Whenever a swamp enters the battlefield under your control, choose 1, you draw a card and lose 1 life, or Dread Presence deals 2 damage to any target and you gain 2 life. Very powerful card. Love to see it. Sorin's Guide is Sorin's tutor, and that is a 4/2 vampire for 5 mana, and its ability, when Sorin's Guide enters the battlefield, you may search for the Sorin card from your library or your graveyard and put it into your hand. So not the most impressive card, but it is at least a body that you can play, and it can block, or if you're lucky, attack while you wait to set Sorin up, so that's still something. And the other rare is a Gravewaker. That's a 6 mana 5/5 with flying, which is okay, I guess. And it has the ability for 7 mana return a target creature from your graveyard to the battlefield tap, which is powerful. However, this rare is found in the welcome decks, and so this is kind of a waste of a rare slot because you could get something cool actually from the set. But if you already had this welcome deck and you picked one of these Planeswalker decks up, that's going to be kind of disappointing to see another Gravewaker there. Savage Gorger appears to be Sorin's common card. It is a 3 mana 1/1 vampire with flying, and it says at the beginning of your end step, if an opponent lost life this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Savage Gorger. This is very much like the Bloodthirsty Aerialist, a weaker version of it, because this is much stronger for the same amount of mana, and this gains the +1/+1 counter immediately. So this is not as strong, but it's not bad. It does play with the themes of this deck. And then Sorin's uncommon is the Thirsting Bloodlord, a 3/3 for 4 mana, and it's a vampire, and other vampires you control get +1/+1, which is a vampire lord, and that's pretty powerful. It's nice that it synergizes well with the vampires in this deck, and I like this a lot. And I also like that it doesn't require you to have the Sorin Planeswalker in order to activate this. Dark Remedy appears to be another card that is unique to this deck as well. Interesting that there are multiple commons that are added into this deck that aren't in the regular set, as is Sorin's Thirst. So it looks like these decks actually have multiple additional cards that are not actually in the set in the deck, and I kind of like that. It makes the deck feel more special. Then at the end we have the reference cards, which give you some useful information about different elements of the game, from attacking and blocking to Planeswalker loyalty to the different steps of your turn. I think these are good for beginning players to have. This is not as useful. It's just the popular Magic formats. You're really starting off as a casual here, and by the time that you're looking into this stuff, this is not going to be enough information to be useful. On the back here, we have the code that you can use to unlock Sorin on Arena. I've already done this with this code, so don't bother trying, but I will be playing some Arena games with this deck to show you how it works. And that is the contents of the Sorin deck. I'm going to give this a few plays and see how it goes, and I'll be back with my thoughts. So I got to play with this deck a bit, and here are my thoughts. The first thing to note is that this is a vampires deck through and through. Every creature in this deck, aside from the Gravewaker over here and the Dread Presence, is a vampire. And there are 3 Thirsting Bloodlords, which are Vampire Lords, which give all your vampires +1/+1. And so that is one of the major themes of this deck. Sorin himself gives each of your vampires the ability to gain control of target creatures if you can use the ultimate on him. That's not easy to do, and with good reason, because that's an incredibly powerful effect. But that's one of the themes of this deck. Now, the Thirsting Bloodlord and Sorin's ultimate are the only pieces that really tie together the vampire theme, so it's not the strongest theme just by itself, but it is pretty impressive when you can have some vampires on the battlefield and then drop a Thirsting Bloodlord and then all of them get that stat boost, and so it still works fairly well as a vampire themed deck. There is another minor sub theme in this deck, and that is life gain, and you can see it with the payoff in the Bloodthirsty Aerialist, which if you gain life, it gets a +1/+1 counter, and there are several ways of gaining life in this deck. There are the Vampires of the Dire Moon, which have lifelink, the Blood Burglars, which have lifelink on the attack, Vampire Opportunists, while they are arguably one of the weakest cards in the game, if you can get to 8 mana, you can use the Vampire Opportunists to drain your opponent and deal 2 damage to them and gain 2 life, which also triggers the Bloodthirsty Aerialist. This also works with the Savage Gorger, which is sort of the opposite. When your opponent loses life, then you get a +1/+1 counter on those as well. They're very similar to the Bloodthirsty Aerialist, although their stats are far worse. However, because they are flying themselves, they can actually hit your opponent and then grow. And so whether you hit them with the Savage Gorgers, with something else, or you use an effect like the Vampire Opportunist attack effect, the Vampire Opportunist's activated ability, or the Dread Presence's triggered ability, those will all cause the Savage Gorger to grow. So the synergy there is, I think, good enough, even if it's not the strongest, because we're working on multiple fronts here and tying a lot of these cards together. The Dread Presence, again, works with the Savage Gorger as well as the Bloodthirsty Aerialist, and it's just a fine card in a black deck in general, because you can draw cards when you play swamps, which means your later swamps aren't useless, or you can do 2 damage to any target and gain 2 life, which again works with the Savage Gorger and the Bloodthirsty Aerialist. Sorin's Thirst similarly works as removal and life gain, so that's pretty good. And Murder is just a pretty good, no questions asked, kill a creature effect, and so that's really good. The disappointing cards in this group of cards here are Sorin's Guide, which is just a 4/2 for 5 mana. Yes, it does search out Sorin, and Sorin is a decent card, but it doesn't otherwise play into this deck's themes besides just being a vampire. But being a 4/2 vampire is not terribly exciting, and I would have rather had it be like a 3/3 with lifelink or something that plays in a little bit better with this deck's themes, because every single other vampire in this deck does something that's either a payoff or part of the impetus for this, or part of the engine that makes this deck work, and Sorin's Guide does neither, aside from searching up Sorin himself. And so I kind of wish that it had some other ability, and even if the power and toughness had to be reduced for it, although I don't think it needed to. So that was a bit of a disappointment in this deck. The Gravebreaker is also a rather big disappointment for this deck because one, it's a free card that you can get in the Welcome deck, and so it feels just kind of like a waste of rare in this deck, but it also doesn't really play in with any of the themes of this deck. Yes, it can return creatures from the graveyard to the battlefield, and that is a strong effect. And yes, it is a 5/5 flyer. Both of those are good things in themselves, but it really doesn't feel like it's doing anything with this deck, and that is why it's a bit disappointing. Similarly, Dark Remedy, which is a combat trick that gives a creature +1/+3, is very, very unexciting for this deck. The only creature that you really want to cast it on is the Vampire of the Dire Moon, so that it can trade up with the Dark Remedy, and even then it's not exactly the most exciting thing. So that it can trade the Dark Remedy for the creature that is blocking or being blocked by, and that's not really a terribly exciting effect. It doesn't really play in well with any of the other creatures in this deck, and so it feels like a waste of slots as well. I would have preferred some other spell instead of that, or more creatures that might help fill out what this deck is trying to do. Now, this is still a significantly better deck than previous Planeswalker decks. You can see that just in the fact that there are 4 of like all these payoffs and these enablers here, and so the deck is far better constructed. It has a nice curve, and Sorin the Vampire Bloodlord has some pretty strong abilities that I like, but the aforementioned weaker effects here, specifically in the cards that I mentioned, do keep this deck from being a really good version of this deck. Now, all that said, if you want to play a vampire deck, this is a fantastic starting point for that deck because it comes with the 3 Thirsting Bloodlords. These are not available in M20. These are printed just for this Planeswalker deck, I think. It might be in some other supplementary products, but it's not in the main set. So it is a great place to start for a casual vampires deck, and it's also a decent place to start for a life gain deck, or to merge with or to perhaps merge with a Johnny's deck for a life gain deck as well. And so I think that this is still a pretty good deck, especially given where Planeswalker decks have been in the past. But it's not the best deck in the world. It also contains 25 lands. I think that's maybe a little too many lands, maybe 1 too many lands for what this deck is doing in particular, especially if you take my advice and ditch the Gravebreaker, ditch the Storehouse Guides, and ditch the Dark Remedies, and replace them with vampires on the lower end of the curve here, and replace them with vampires or life gain cards on the lower end of the curve here. I think that you could definitely do well with less lands and just 1 Sorin. So that's my thoughts. Let me know what your thoughts were about this deck in the comments below. If you found this video helpful, hit the like button. If you'd like to see more such videos, hit subscribe. This was Refresh. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.